Welcome to Renegade Inc, the show that allows us to think differently. Every once in a while, an idea surfaces that catches the imagination of the public, academics, policy wonks, economists, entrepreneurs, and even some governments. Universal basic income is one of those ideas and, after plenty of debate, has predictably divided opinion into two opposing camps. There are those who think that a universal or unconditional basic income would result in disaster, as human beings can't be trusted. The other camp feel that a universal basic income would liberate, allowing people to concentrate on the important things in life, not just earning a living. Rutger Bregman is a writer who is widely acclaimed for his book Utopia for Realists. In it, he champions universal basic income and a 15-hour work week. So, we went to the Netherlands to ask him if the time for these ideas has arrived. When you look at the developed West and you look at economies and societies now, what do you see?
Wasn't it Charles Dickens who wrote, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times? Or the other way around? I mean, I see that we made incredible progress, obviously, in the past 200 years. I mean, we're richer, we are wealthier, we are healthier than ever. And that's great. It's really something we should celebrate. You know, if you would go to the 17th century, kidnap someone and use a time machine to bring him back again, he or she would say, like, this is utopia. You've done it, you know, you've made utopia real.
Right.
I think that the big problem of today is that we don't know where to go next. We don't have a big utopian vision of how we could radically improve our lives in the 21st century.
So bringing the realist in, as opposed to the utopian dreamer, how do you begin to sell that vision?
I think it starts with acknowledging that every milestone of civilization, the end of slavery, democracy, equal rights for men and women, the welfare state as we have it now, these were all utopian fantasies once. Utopias become real all the time. But it's also important to remember that it works both ways. You know, think about something like Brexit. Just 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that was completely unimaginable. Think about something like the rise of Donald Trump. You know, we would laugh about an idea like that just 5 years ago. And it happens. So it works both ways, I think. Real change never comes from the center. It always comes from the fringes, where the crazy people are, you know? And then these ideas start going towards the center. So a lot of journalists focus on the politicians in the center or whatever, but I'm not really interested, because that's not where the real action is.
Where does social change begin?
It starts with the people who are first dismissed as unreasonable, lunatics. They're unrealistic, their plans are unaffordable, and that's where it starts. So especially if you're young and people call you unrealistic, you should be happy, because that's exactly what you should be.
Do you often hear when people say to other people, the problem with you is you're an idealist? Mm-hmm. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the funny thing is that in Western culture, we often equate realism with pessimism. So the pessimist is always seen as a realist, like, yeah, that's probably, it's human nature, most people are selfish, and yeah, that's realistic take on humanity. I think it's completely the other way around.
Why?
If you look at recent scientific evidence from anthropology, from biology, from even new developments in economics, turns out that most people are pretty nice. Most people want to make something of their lives. Most people have ambitions, are creative, are altruistic. You know, there are very deep evolutionary roots for all this behavior. And it matters what we assume in each other. So if we assume that most people are creative, are altruistic, are full of empathy, then that's what we get. But what do? We create a welfare state, we create a democracy, etc., that is based on the idea that most people are selfish. Well, guess what happens? You know, that's what you get out of people if you do that.
What's our fundamental assumption of a fellow human being?
That most people can't be trusted. I think the best example is what's happening in the welfare state. I mean, this is the case in Holland, it's the case in UK. If you want to get some support from the government, you have to prove all over again that you're depressed enough, that you're sick enough, that you are really a hopeless case that won't get anything done in your life. You have to fill in thousands of forms and go to interviews with dozens of government officials. And then finally, at the end of the road, when you are really depressed, maybe they'll give you a little bit of support. And then we're surprised that people become depressed out of that. You know, it's a system that produces dependency. It's a system that produces depression, etc. Because that's what we assume in other people. Now, what I would say is, let's turn it completely around. What if we say to everyone, especially the poor and the working poor, what if we say, well, I think you've got great ideas, you just lack the means. Here are the means. I'm very curious to see what you'll come up with. And that's basic income. It's very simple.
And when that argument hits the pessimists, what is the most common refrain or the most common pushback that you get from coming up and putting that case?
The first thing people say is, if you would give me a basic income,
right,
that would be great. But if you give other people a basic income,
yes,
they'll probably waste it. You know, drugs, alcohol, Netflix, it's human nature. Like people just want to be lazy.
Do people just want to be lazy?
Well, what I always respond then is, let's just look at the scientific evidence. I mean, we can have an argument for hours about human nature and philosophy and blah, blah, blah. But we've got decades of scientific evidence researching exactly this question. And turns out every single time we experiment with basic income, it works. People are not lazy, you know? We've got huge experiments from Canada and the US in the 1970s. We've got dozens of cash transfer programs around the world. And every single time, turns out that the reductions in total amount of work hours is mostly 1, maybe 2, maybe 3%, that's it. And this is all compensated by people doing more volunteers work.
Let's look at the refugee situation in Europe. If people are selfish, competitive, nasty, why did we get one of the biggest humanitarian responses since the Second World War in Europe?
Well, I remember quite vividly that during the height of what they call the refugee crises, right?
Which is actually a situation.
Yeah. When that happened in 2015, my sister called me and she was angry because she had volunteered to help these refugees, but she was put on a waiting list. And I was reading the newspapers at that time, and all the newspapers were about, oh, it's a terrible disaster and there are a lot of angry citizens out there and how will we ever cope? But my sister was angry about that. She was put on a waiting list. Turns out this was happening everywhere.
Too many volunteers.
1 month later calculated that there were 2 volunteers for every refugee coming in. So this was the big story, but it was hardly reported in the media because the news is always about what's going wrong, you know. If you watch a lot of the news, at the end of the day, you know exactly how the world does not work because you have only heard about these exceptions.
It brings us to cognitive dissonance. The story we tell ourselves about the world, the story that is actually happening in the world are 2 different things. And often we get the story that we tell ourselves about the world from the news, and they have their own agenda, and it often doesn't match up to the human agenda. How do you begin to heal this cognitive dissonance? Because we do exactly the same thing in economics. The thing we tell ourselves about how the economy works and how it actually works are 2 different things.
Oh, it's completely upside down, yeah.
How have we got it so badly wrong?
We've come to live in what you could call an inverse welfare state. The story that we are told is that there are a lot of very productive, ambitious people on the top, and they earn a lot of money, but they also pay a lot of taxes, and we should be grateful for them.
Because ultimately they're wealth creators.
Exactly. But if you look what is really happening in the economy, for example, when you just ask people themselves, do you think your job is useful or not? Then you'll find out that many of these so-called wealth creators, they think that their job is utterly bullshit. There is an almost perfect correlation that the more money you earn, the more likely it is that you think that your own job doesn't have much of value. I'm not talking about the teachers or the garbage collectors or the nurses. I'm talking about consultants, corporate lawyers, bankers. These are the people who often tend to think that their job doesn't have much of value.
Is it too glib to say that you can actually now divide this neoliberal economy that we live and work in and endure? Could you divide it into 2 groups of people, the wealth extractors and the wealth creators?
Let's look at it historically first. 3-4 centuries ago, most wealth came from the land, right? If you owned the land, you were rich and you could just sit back and relax because everyone would pay rent to you. Nowadays, real estate and the land is still important, you know, it's still an important source of wealth and inequality. But there are other things as well. If you own money, if you own technologies, if you own knowledge, etc., you can rentier on that as well. But the crazy thing is that we often use the language of work and creativity and wealth creating to describe what is in fact just sitting back and doing nothing and just collecting these rents. The most pernicious example of it is the internet economy. You know, Google, Facebook, Amazon, these are all rentier companies. What they basically do is they let us pay to access our content that we provide to them for free. You know, Google and Facebook, they get about, 60-70% of all advertising revenue these days because they have huge monopoly power.
Is this Rentier Economy 2.0?
Exactly. It's all coming back, and this is also what you see, in the data and the statistics, is that inequality is obviously growing. More and more of the rich get their income out of capital, out of owning what they have. But even a lot of people who seem like they earn their money with working are actually just earning their money with collecting these rents. And the best example is the financial sector.
Do you include the housing market in that?
The financial sector would be unimaginable without the housing market. But if you look at recent reports from the International Monetary Fund, it's not a very left-wing think tank, right? But even they write that when a financial sector becomes too big,
yes,
becomes bigger than 100% of GDP, it starts gobbling up wealth, it starts destroying wealth instead of creating it. This is the case in almost every developed country.
Where are we then with Wall Street on the GDP scale? Do you have a percentage?
I think Wall Street is above 200%. I know from Holland it's 278%. So you could say that more than half of all bankers should be earning a negative salary because they destroy more wealth than they create. There are a lot of people on the right who like to talk about meritocracy. Well, I think that's a great idea. If we would have a real meritocracy, then the nurses, the garbage collectors, and the teachers would earn the most, and the bankers and the consultants and the corporate lawyers would have to pay for doing their work because they destroy more wealth than they create. And this is also what's wrong with the approach of the left often, is that what they do, they say, oh, well, the poor, we should help them, right? And we should pity them, we should give them money because they can't take care of themselves or something like that. No, it's completely the other way around. We are dependent on the lower middle classes. If they would stop working, it would be a disaster. If all the garbage collectors stop working, it's a disaster. I found only one example throughout history that the bankers went on strike. In Ireland, 1970.
What happened?
The strike lasted for 6 months and nothing happened. Right.
But this is the point, isn't it? Unless we understand this, we are caught in this terrible Mexican standoff.
Exactly.
What's the logical progression of this trajectory that we're on?
Oh, this could go on for a very long time. People often ask me, when can we introduce something like a basic income? When will we be rich enough? Do we have to wait for the robots or something like that will take all our jobs? And I always say that the real obstacle towards moving to a society like that is not about economics. It's not a financial problem. It's an ideological problem. So we need to update our ideas about what work is. Who are the real wealth creators? What is progress? What is real efficiency? So it's really a matter of ideas.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc, the show that allows us to think differently. Before we talk more with Rutger Bregman about a realistic utopia and a universal basic income, let's have a look at our favourite tweets in this week's Renegade Inc Index. First up, we have a tweet from Pixel Pump. Can you imagine a world of 7.6 billion people no longer struggling for food or shelter and now focused on bettering the world for their children? That's universal basic income, and that's a legacy we can all leave. Next, from Basic Income Images, we need to stop measuring the economy by how well rich people are doing, #basic income. Next up, we have a tweet from 4-Day Week Campaign. Only a fraction of the available human labour in the world is now needed for the production of the total amount of goods necessary for life. Therefore, the number of hours per week ought to be reduced by law so that unemployment is systematically abolished. That's from a guy called Albert Einstein, apparently written in 1933. And finally, from Anis Kizilbash, after food poisoning, you're careful about what you consume, so why don't people apply the same logic to media consumption? And as you can imagine, we couldn't agree more with that. With ideas like universal basic income, it is easy to be hypothetical and lofty. So, how would an experiment or wider system be implemented? We asked the Finnish government agency Kela how they are going about it.
In Finland, income security is guaranteed to everyone, but the current social security system was created decades ago in a very different world from today. A new social security model, universal basic income, was trialled in 2017 by Finnish government agency Kela. The aim was to determine whether the social security system would be simplified and provide a stronger incentive for finding employment. At present, Finding a job does not necessarily increase the income of an unemployed person because the earnings compromise their social benefits. 2,000 unemployed people aged between 25 to 58 were chosen at random for the basic income experiment. The participants receive a basic monthly income of €560. Should their unemployment benefit be higher than the basic income, the participant can apply for the exceeding amount. The basic income is a tax-free benefit and will not be reduced by any other income the participant has. So if the participant finds a job during the experiment, they will get both the salary and the basic income. The trial will run for 2 years and the employment situation of the participants will be monitored throughout. The aim of this experiment in Finland is to answer the question, could basic income increase employment and simplify the social security system?
Congratulations on the book.
Thanks.
You said that it was a sort of a process where you'd put it out there, you'd get feedback, you'd go back, and a lot of authors don't speak in that way. They publish something and then move on.
Isn't that crazy?
But so how has this changed you?
I first published this book in 2014 in the Netherlands. Then you get a lot of feedback from readers and you develop your thinking, and this edition is quite different from the original edition.
So you changed your mind, Rutger.
Yeah, but I think that's a good thing, right? You got to keep on thinking.
What was the big thing that you learned that you hadn't stumbled across while you were writing it?
One of the most important ideas in the book is obviously the idea of basic income. Completely eradicating poverty with providing a floor in the income distribution. Now, when I first wrote about this, it was a completely forgotten idea. So my task as a writer, as an intellectual back then, was just to tell people this idea exists. But I was absolutely astonished that, just a couple of years later, the idea was everywhere. Now I'm suddenly in a very different phase. And people ask me very practical questions like, what is the next step? Now, what I always emphasize is that a basic income pays for itself because healthcare costs go down, crime goes down, kids perform much better in school. This is what we find in every single basic income experiment. It is cheaper to eradicate poverty than to combat the symptoms of poverty. If you look at the US, for example, a floor in the income distribution that would completely get rid of poverty would be about $300-400 billion, while the cost of child poverty was recently calculated at $500 billion. So as I said, $500 billion to combat the symptoms of child poverty, $300-400 billion to eradicate poverty. It's not rocket science,
If you go to the US, you can bet your bottom dollar that people will come to you and say, the problem, Rutger, is you are a socialist. How do you begin to defrost that frozen conflict so we can get over the isms, socialism, capitalism, whatever you want to dress this as?
It's all about language.
Right. So
and this is really where the left needs to learn a lot of things.
So how do you begin to get the left to start using the language of utopia, optimism, hope?
You need to conquer the language of progress. In politics, there is an eternal battle for the words like freedom, efficiency, progress, work, wealth creators, etc., etc. And what the left has done is has basically surrendered these concepts and said, all right, well, maybe your economy is more efficient, and maybe your economy, has the real wealth creators, blah, 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 but at least we are moral, at least we care for the poor, etc. And that maybe that works with a small segment of the population, but the vast majority of the population thinks, well, those are the losers, those are the winners, I'm going to vote for them. It's what I call underdog socialism, and it doesn't win you elections. It only cares for the losers, It's always worrying about, we should help the losers, we should pity the losers. It talks down on them, it's often very paternalistic. They don't need your advice, whatever. The real experts in the poor's lives are the poor themselves. They just need to be given the means to make those choices.
And is this the idea that the poor make very good short-term decisions, but long-term they're pretty awful because they are not used to that planning?
Exactly.
Because they don't have the means.
This is where also recent scientific research comes in that shows that poverty is not a lack of character, but just a lack of cash. And if you get people out of poverty, they start making much better decisions, especially for the long term. This is what the left needs to do. It shouldn't only talk about what it's against, but also about what it's for.
When people come to you and say, this is all very good and we'll tolerate you for some time, but we've also got another function of state, which is the taxation system. Why are we going universal basic income and not tweaking the tax system to allow people to keep what they make and pay for what they take?
I think we should do both, right? So who will pay for this basic income? I think that it should be paid out of these rents.
Which rents?
We live in a renter society because we've become so rich in the past 2 decades, and 200 years, you could even say. Most of the wealth comes from rents from the past, right? We've been given this huge gift. We are richer, wealthier, healthier than ever. And we didn't work for it. So you could see a basic income as a dividend of progress. Because our forefathers worked so hard, we can now afford to give everyone a dividend like that. It's just nowadays only the rich receive it,
Right.
but we could share that equally.
And what you're bringing us to is the paradox that sits in the heart of our economies and our societies. And I think you've called it the paradox of plenty. It isn't a new idea, is it? And it isn't a new conundrum that we have to fix. It's been here for aeons. Let me start by asking you, what is the paradox of plenty and how do you begin to unlock it?
I always think that the ideas that I argue for in my book, they're not very difficult. Most working class people already know them. I'm basically more talking to the higher educated people in the knowledge economy, blah, 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 who have forgotten these obvious things.
Right.
It's interesting that when you start talking in the language of money, then and you say, well, basic income costs this and that, many billions of dollars or euros or pounds, then suddenly we start thinking that we can't afford to do something about this. Look at something like unemployment. If you have a country where millions of people don't work, that's not a good thing, right? Everyone understands that. That's a waste of human capital, human ambition, talent, etc. But what did we do in Greece? I mean, the European Commission and Union basically destroyed Greece because it wanted to have their money back. Basically what you're doing, you're kicking a beggar in the face and saying, give me my money back, and then you're suddenly surprised that you don't get any money back. Obviously they don't get your money back, they don't have a job.
But that very stubborn Teutonic German mindset, which is finance driven, it's very, very difficult to unlock that because the numbers are on the sheet and that's what you owe, and a debt is a debt and it's related to guilt in that culture.
Exactly. But it's not undoable. I mean, if you look at the history of social democracy, for example, it used to be very simple in the 50s or the 60s. What social democrats said, oh, we've got millions of people who are unemployed. We'll give them a job. You don't need a PhD to come up with these kind of solutions.
One of the things I found really interesting in Utopia for Realists is this idea that we should reject the dogma that we do have to work for a living. If you said that to the right-wing press, can you imagine the fallout? Of course, we have hard-working families, everyone has to work. If you don't work, you're a failure.
Well, this is one of the things where my thinking has developed a little bit since publishing the book. Because I understand now that it's all about the question, what is work, right? The crazy thing is that nowadays, people are forced to sit in an office, send emails to people they don't like, write reports no one is ever going to read.
Shop on Amazon.
And we call that work? What is it? Is that wealth creating? Obviously it's not. So we need to work less, do less paid work in order to do more. Look what's happening right now. We've got the graying of society, more and more older people in our society. What is it really important? Well, that we care for them. Who's doing all this caring? Well, obviously, nurses are incredibly important, but volunteers as well. And there are so many people in their 30s or in their 40s who have both to care for their kids and for the elderly. This is the great challenge. Meanwhile, they're most of their time in those offices, doing those useless stuff that they don't care about. And it's not me saying it, it's people themselves saying it. That's the crazy thing, when historians will look back on our time, they'll think, what kind of bizarre religion was this? That people were all sitting in, a room together with each other and, sending messages and having meetings, and no one really knew what was going on and why it was all for. Psychologists call it pluralistic ignorance. We all think that someone is in charge and someone knows what this is all for. And everyone thinks that of each other. And then you just need one or two people who say, why do we actually do this? And then everyone's like, yeah, I was wondering that as well.
Here's the other aspect. When you're looking after children, what you're saying by redefining work, one of the most valuable things you can do is look after children because as a whole, as a nation as a whole, that's ultimately investment. So this redefinition of work, you're not saying we should all go to the beach.
No, not at all, not at all. It's actually the countries with the shortest paid working weeks. Those are the countries where people devote the most time to each other, volunteers work, caring for the elderly, etc., where they have the most social capital. And it's the countries with the longest paid working weeks, the US, Japan, and Turkey, where people watch the most television and where the social capital is lowest.
Do you see a difference then between money and wealth?
When I started studying economics, I had a revelation. I thought, productivity, how do economists define this? I looked at the definition and it said productivity is the amount of money you earn or the amount of value you contribute towards GDP, gross domestic product. And I thought, this is utterly crazy.
Yeah.
There are so many people who earn very little but contribute a lot, and there are a lot of people who earn a lot but contribute very little. That seems to me completely upside down, but the newspapers are full of it. I think that we need to go back to very basic definitions. You're productive when you do something useful, when you create something of value that other people care about. There are a lot of smart people, very well-educated people, very successful people, that so-called wealth creators, who are tax lawyers, accountants, working in Amsterdam and earn a lot of money. But do they create wealth? No, they destroy it. They rip other people off. That's what they do. But economists call it productivity, and they call it wealth creating, whatever. It's completely upside down. I've been researching the Christmas truces during the First World War. Turns out that the people who hated the Germans the most were all in Britain at the time, and especially newspapers like the Daily Mail and Daily Telegraph. But the closer you came to the front, the more sympathy there was for the enemy. And then during these Christmas truces, they started singing Christmas carols, and they discovered, wait, these people are just like us. I see that as a metaphor. If you actually go out there, meet real people on the streets, turns out that reality is quite different than what comes to you from these kind of media sources. We worry a lot about what we put into our bodies, the kind of food we eat. We should also think a lot about what kind of ideas we put into our heads.
You strike me as an optimist.
Well, I'm a possibilist. Optimism, I associate that with everything will be all right. History is a roller coaster ride. Just sit down, relax, everything's going to be great. This is a Silicon Valley mantra, right? Technology will solve all our problems. I'm a possibilist. I believe that history teaches us that things can be different, but there's nothing inevitable about that. We can mess it up as well, especially if we just sit down and do nothing. And history also shows us that quite small minorities can make a huge difference. The first women who started arguing for, we want the right to vote, did they have the most power in society? Obviously not. Did they have the most money? Obviously not. Were they a vast majority? No. But they did have the best idea. So it all comes down to ideas.
Rutger, thank you very much for your time. Congratulations on the book.
Thanks so much for having me.
We look forward to the next book.
Working on it.
And we look forward to more ideas.
I'll do my best.